Gregorius, who I'm going to call Greg, is a large, light armored total assault boss where your success depends on the debuffs you can bring and the AoE damage you can output. The fight with Greg has a lot of things going on at the same time, and honestly, you're probably not going to retain much information from this video due to how overwhelming it is, but that's okay. After giving this video one pass, I give the boss a mock and observe what he does. The fight is completely scripted from beginning to end, so once you've seen that script play out, you can come back to this video and give it another watch. It will probably make much more sense the second time around. What I will do for you is cover the details of that script and provide some general guidance on how you can react to what Greg throws at you. If you prefer reading text, I have document guides written by myself linked in the description of this video. Otherwise, welcome to SCHALE Raid Tactics. I'm Kozyu and thank you for coming. Before getting into the boss's abilities, I have to explain the main mechanic underpinning the whole raid. Next to Greg's HP bar is a counter, representing the number of debuffs Greg is inflicted with. When Greg has a certain number of debuffs, the counter will change between 3 colored statuses from red to yellow to green. On the screen right now are the number of debuffs you need for each status on extreme and below. For each difficulty above extreme, you can add 1 to both sides of each split. Of course, these colors aren't just for show. Whenever the counter is red, Greg will have 40% extra attack, while you have no benefit. When the counter is yellow, Greg will only have 20% extra attack, but your students will now deal double their usual damage. Finally, when the counter is green, Greg will have no extra attack and your team will deal 3 times as much damage. This debuff counter makes the objective of the raid very clear. You must try to maintain the green status for as much of the raid as possible. For extreme and below, this means that you should try to maintain a constant 4 or 5 debuffs. This is mostly simple, but there is a long list of nuances that can make stacking debuffs a little complicated. The full list of these nuances is in my text guide, but if you don't like reading, I'll go over the most important ones here. Firstly, crowd control like fear, taunts and stuns are not debuffs. Using any of these will not add to the counter. Secondly, the usual debuff stacking rules apply. If the debuffs stack, then each instance will go towards the counter. If the debuffs do not stack, then they will override each other. For example, Arcana X and Maki Basic stack, so this will add 2 to the counter. Arcana X and Hiyori X don't stack, so there will only be 1 added to the counter. If you use Arcana X twice in a row, it will override itself, so there will only be 1 added to the counter. Finally, debuffs that deal damage, like poison and burns, also add to the counter. There are quite a lot of rules involved with debuff stacking, but as you mock the raid and throw various debuffs at the boss, these rules will become more clear to you. To summarize the entire mechanic, use debuffs, green counter, big damage. Going into Greg's active skills, the most important one is the choir he summons to fight alongside him. This choir will regularly spawn and despawn at fixed intervals. At the beginning, Greg will only have a small number of choir members in front of him. After 1 minute, a choir will spawn to your left. After another minute, the left choir will despawn and another choir will spawn on the right. Finally, after that minute passes, the boss will enter its final phase, where a large number of choir members will spawn on both his left and right. The choir is very important to how you will approach this boss. Obviously, they attack you, and having lots of enemies attack you at the same time can get very deadly very fast, so you will need to kill them. More importantly, all damage you deal against this choir will be reflected onto Greg. Even when the choir reaches 0 HP and are knocked out, your damage will continue to reflect to Greg. To help you deal even more damage, any non-damaging debuffs on Greg, including the effects of the debuff counter, will be reflected to the choir. These factors make AoE damage extremely important. Your attacks aren't just going to be multiplied by the debuff counter, they will also be multiplied for every single choir member you hit. If you can hit 7 choir members, you are dealing 7 times your usual damage. With the green status effect, that makes it a total of 21 times your usual damage. Greg is intentionally designed for you to interact with these multipliers. If you were to only use single target damage, you would never be able to cut through his HP. Oh, and the choir gets stronger if you leave him alone for too long, so even if you did have enough single target damage, they will kill you before you could kill the boss. If your brain is about to explode at this point of the video, then that's okay. This entire raid can be summarized into 2 main objectives: keep the counter green and drop bombs on the choir. As long as you are doing both of these, you will generally be okay. Don't be afraid to give the boss a try first before coming back to watch the rest of the mechanics section, because it starts getting complicated from here on. If you can keep going, then let's look at the main way Greg tries to mess with you, the organ. Every so often, Greg will play a sound wave through the organ pipes on the map. There are 4 types of sound waves, each of which are color coded and have unique effects. These sound waves will be played in the same order every time: yellow, blue, red, white, yellow, blue, red and white. First up is the yellow wave. This wave will always deal critical damage, and then it debuffs your striker's attack by 40% for 2 minutes. There is literally nothing you can do about this attack. You will eat a crit to the face, and then you're gonna have to heal it off afterwards. If your units are on level, they will probably lose almost all of their HP, so you will have to make sure they're full health before the yellow wave comes. Now, this sounds unfair, because it is. There is no punchline. The blue wave is played from the center organ pipes. It will apply a 50% increased damage taken debuff to either your team or Greg depending on the direction it is facing. You can tell which way it is facing by the direction of the blue spikes, and you can change the direction of the wave by attacking the organ. The red wave is played from behind Greg. It will have one of 2 effects depending on how many debuffs Greg has. If the debuff counter is on the lower side of the green status, 1 debuff will be taken away. If the debuff counter is on the higher side of the green status, 1 debuff will be added. The purpose of this wave is to annoy you and make it harder for you to maintain the green status. Finally, the white wave is played from the center organ pipes. It will cleanse 1 debuff from either your students or Greg depending on the direction it is facing. Just like the blue wave, you can tell which side it is facing by the markings in front of the organ, and you can turn it around by attacking that organ. Each sound wave by themselves aren't that complicated, but there's 4 of them, and trying to keep track of what you need to do when they come up can be very overwhelming. To make this easier, I'll simplify the problem into 2 scenarios. What do you do when you have too few debuffs, and what do you do if you have too many debuffs? The easier of the 2 is if you have too few debuffs. In this case, the white wave is very simple to handle. When you see it coming, face it towards your team so that the counter won't decrease. Easy. The blue wave is also intuitive when you have too few debuffs. Face it towards Greg to add an extra debuff to a counter, helping you maintain that green status. You also gain the benefit of the debuff itself, to deal an extra 50% damage. When you have too few debuffs, the red wave will decrease the counter by 1. You can't stop this from happening, but you should be mindful that it will always cleanse the most recent debuff. This means you can manipulate it by applying a short or useless debuff you don't care about just before the red wave hits. That useless debuff will be removed and the impact to your counter will be minimized. If you don't have any useless debuffs, well, you're going to have to tolerate the inconvenience. And then there's the yellow wave. It will kill you, bad luck. Now, what do you do if you have too many debuffs? For the white wave, you should face it towards Greg. It might seem strange to be helping the boss, but remember, your primary goal is to maintain green status. The white wave will help you lower your counter if you have too many debuffs. For the blue wave, you might have to consider facing it towards your team if you have too many debuffs. The team will take an extra 50% damage, which is obviously not a good thing, but the alternative of inflating the counter when it is already too high is worse. You really want that green status, so having your team take extra damage for the sake of maintaining the status is a trade-off you will have to tolerate. You will also miss out on the extra damage that comes from the debuff itself. However, the damage you deal with green status is more than the damage you will deal with yellow status plus the debuff. The red wave is especially bad when you have too many debuffs. Greg will gain an extra debuff that will last for 2 minutes, which is a really long time and it will absolutely mess with your flow. The only way to remove it will be to use the white wave, but for the white wave to work, you cannot use any other debuff in between the red and white wave. This is pretty hard to do, so a lot of the time you might not be able to cleanse it, in which case you will have no choice but to change your skill usage to avoid debuffing Greg. This is usually a bit difficult, so ideally you would try to avoid this situation. And then we have the yellow wave. this wave actually has a secret second color, black, from when your game fades out into the fail screen. The sound waves have a lot going on with them, but thankfully they come out in a fixed order. By doing the same thing every time, your results will look the same. If you practice while anticipating the order and the effects of each sound wave, it will make it easier to figure out what you need to do bit by bit until you get to the end of the raid. It is a lot of work, but because it's scripted, you hopefully only need to learn it once. Speaking of the end, Greg enters his final phase in the last minute of the fight. After a short cutscene, 20 choir minions will spawn, 10 on either side of Greg. During this last minute, your team gets a massive cost generation buff, and the choir will attack faster. Both of these buffs get more intense every 10 seconds. The raid ends after 50 seconds, where your team will have a scripted death with 10 seconds remaining on the clock. This last phase is the most important part of the raid. Provided that your counter is green, your job during this minute is to spam your damage as much as you can. With how fast your cost is building and how many choir minions there are, it will not be unusual to do more damage in this last minute than the entire rest of the raid. The fight ends with you killing the boss or the boss killing you. If the boss kills you, you will have to start the script from the beginning with a new team. That covers all of Greg's mechanics and abilities. Again, that was a lot of information, but believe me, it makes much more sense once you try the raid out for yourself a couple of times. Next up comes the team building. As Blue Archive gets older, we recommend students to bring to a fight may change, but what will not change are the fundamental principles for building the team. I would advise paying attention to the roles you have to fill out on the team rather than the students themselves. With that said, against Gregorius I would recommend to have on each team at the minimum 1 AoE, 1 tank, 1 healer, and as many debuffs as necessary. You want at least 1 AoE damage dealer on your team. Ideally, you should have 2, because it's very important to keep up the pace in your damage. Having only 1 damage dealer may leave too many gaps in between your damage windows. This might allow the choir to overwhelm your team. Also, 2 damage dealers will let you take better advantage of the final phase. These damage dealers preferably come from the special slot, because strikers are not only at risk of dying, but for most of the raid they will be suffering a major attack debuff. Specials can't get debuffed by on-field effects, so they have the advantage in dealing damage. At recommended level, the choir hurts a lot, so you're going to need a tank. Ideally, this tank will have a debuff to relieve the stress on your other debuffers, but it's also fine if they don't have any. You're also going to need a healer. With the constant threat of the yellow wave, your team won't last very long if they are unable to top up after taking damage. Preferably, your healers will be strikers so you have room to field DPS in your special slots. If you have no striker healers, then sadly, you will have to use that special slot. The rest of the team will consist of as many debuffers as necessary for you to hit green. Debuffers with multiple debuffs are the most valuable, but be careful not to bring too many or the counter may become difficult to manage. That's all for the team building. Fitting enough debuffs into your team is quite hard if you only bring single purpose units. Using units that can do their roles and debuff is ideal, but if you don't have these units, you're just going to have to try your best. Normally I would reveal some strats or techniques that will make the boss easier to handle, but unfortunately there aren't any major strats or techs for Greg. Greg will always stick to his script, so you will have to try your best learning that script through mock battles while keeping the main goals in mind. Apply debuffs, drop AoE, don't die. This concludes the Gregorius raid guide. There are quite a few details I skipped on purpose, because finding a way to properly convey that information via video is really difficult. If you're interested in learning every single tiny detail about the boss, please do check out the written guide. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the spectacle that Gregorius presents. In my opinion, Nexon might have taken the boss a bit too far in its design. Although he is at least interesting, I'm not sure if all the gameplay elements are suitable for the game's current environment. Luckily, because he is scripted, and because the mechanics help you deal way too much damage, it doesn't feel that bad, especially on lower difficulties. This video has been my longest one yet because I had a lot of abilities to cover, but despite that, I don't feel like the boss has much depth. Wide as an ocean, shallow as a puddle, they say. Oh well, regardless, I wish you luck and hope you have fun.